Okay, so this talk today is centering on implicit biases, not just talking about them, but also identifying and how we manage them. Our objectives for this afternoon is that you'll identify how your own intersecting cultural identities inform your interactions with others, describe the significance of cultural values and implicit bias in the workplace or in your setting that you're in. I know some of you are in the community or ombudsman, have different roles and hats that you wear, but whatever setting that you're in where you're interacting with more than yourself. Identify one change that you will make as a result of this training. So I really want you to take a moment as you're listening to my lecture and we're having our interactions to think about what is it that you can change yourself. And then I'll share with you what my longstanding implicit bias is that I've worked on. So again, we want you to be reflective, self-aware, understand techniques for reducing bias, and kind of focus areas of and why, and why. The rules of engagement I kind of mentioned, but I just want to throw those out there again. Being respectful, active listening, being open, and again, all questions are welcome. Disagreeing is okay. Like I said, unfortunately, because of our climate these days, we forgot how to disagree with people and still remain friends. No judging of comments, and this is really going to be a participant-driven time. So I know that we're probably all zoomed out, but please put any comments in the chat if you don't feel like you want to unmute yourself and talk. However works for you is what we're going to do today. So let's talk about the unconscious mind. So the first thing I want to say is that we all have a bias. It's just the way we are. That doesn't mean that we're bad people. It's a way in which our feelings, our motives, and decisions are made. And it's very much influenced by whatever our past experiences are. And given the range of, I don't know how old anybody is on this call, but I know how old I am. And I know that we all come from a different set of experiences. I grew up in what you call the hood on the west side of Warren, Ohio, and was one of those people that were bused to predominantly white school and middle school, and went through all those experiences that shape who I am today. But it also creates some biases that I have. So unconscious, there are attitudes and feelings which we are unaware of, and they can be powerful and influence our behavior. And the unconscious of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the conscious. So I know that sounds sort of like a circular quagmire type of a statement, but just understanding that a lot of this is just below the surface, probably deeper than what we even realize. So there was a really good Institute of Medicine report that was done way back in, I think it might have been like 2003, but it still holds pretty true to this day about unequal treatment and racial and ethnic disparities within healthcare. So, what does the evidence say about racial, ethnic disparities, gender disparities, and all types of disparities that happen in the healthcare setting? Is that, again, I mentioned that most healthcare providers appear to have implicit bias, with positive attitudes towards whites and negative attitudes towards Blacks. And then let me just put a little disclaimer here. A lot of what I talk about refers to Blacks or African Americans, but I acknowledge that that is not the only minoritized group of people in the United States and elsewhere. So I just wanted to put that there first. So a lot of my examples are reflective of that space, mainly too, because I identify as Black and African American, and also the work that I do focuses in this population, but this is by no means ignoring the rest of our wonderful rainbow of people and colors. So implicit bias may contribute to health disparities for people of color. So we know that within, especially in Native American populations, as well as disparities that are encountered by caregivers who are of the Asian descent, that East Asian, South Asian, that go into the healthcare setting with providers having preconceived ideas about the individual that stem from, as we said, the unconscious experiences that we may have had even in childhood and how we were reared. So some of the common concerns related to discrimination in aging, there was a really good qualitative study that was done by Peroni in 2022. And if anybody's interested, I can send you the article about it. But it was a study of long-term care facilities and the staff that were there. And that kind of brought back a lot of memories for me as a young African-American nurse. My first job was a licensed practical nurse at the tender age of 18. Yeah, I was really advanced and smart. So, and working in that type of an environment and experiencing firsthand discrimination from older adults. So what tends to happen is that from the staff perspective, they just kind of minimize that discriminatory behavior and just think of it as, well, we just kind of expect it because they're older and, they're back in the South days of Jim Crow when they were thinking this way. So that's why they've said these harsh things to you, or don't touch me with your inward fingers and that kind of thing. And just accepting it as a condition of employment. So I'd like to say one day we need to push back on that and challenge that it should not be, especially for people who are in those type of care working conditions, LPNs working in extended care, RNs, nurse aides that are working in those areas. They're not, it's a high stress job with lots of physical, mental, emotional burden without proper insurance and monetary compensation for the work they do. So at some point, from a administrative perspective, we have to be able to have a better process for when these things occur, and they do in the long-term care setting. Re-traumatization of older adults and past experiences. So I'll share my own personal experience with this. When my mom passed away suddenly in 2005, after taking care of my dad who had Alzheimer's disease. And then, the sisters got together and took care of dad for a while. And so it got to a point where it was too difficult. And I know that when I was talking with Michelle, she mentioned someone had talked about African Americans, or questioning, kind of the rationale behind African Americans keeping their elders or their older adults in the home longer and not placing them into long-term care facilities. And so there's lots of reasons behind that. Many that deal with social determinants of health and income, not having the money to go to a, quote, nicer place or facility, or those places that are predominantly Black or African American not having the same care standards. The issue of Medicaid going into a facility, it's different. But from my own personal experience, and then going back to the re-traumatization story, is that So it came to a point where we had to put my dad into an assisted living facility. And so me being the organizer and geriatric know-it-all, found a very nice place for him to go to, and just, pristine, wonderful. And fortunately he had resources that he could pay for it. But the thing that I didn't acknowledge and really understand, which my older sister, who kind of helped me to understand this, is that for him, being in a place where most of the people were not Black, and coming from the Deep South at a time, he was born in 1918. So, he saw a lot of things, and a lot of things happened to him. So it was a re-traumatizing experience for him to be in a place where there was predominantly white people and not Black people. Fortunately, one of my nieces worked also as a nurse aide there and was able to visit and comfort him. But sometimes, we're trying to do the thing that we think is best for people, but in hindsight, maybe going to a facility where there were more Black people would have been more comforting for him, even though the level of care may have not been what I would have wanted. The other aspect to think of with re-traumatization is that even in community older adults, especially since the pandemic and everything that happened with George Floyd and the continued police violence and such that we've experienced in our nation at this past 3-4 years even, so that a lot of the older adults that I've worked with in the community have expressed to me that they feel very vulnerable, and it brings back a lot of the memories of when they were marching during the civil rights movement, but even more vulnerable now because they're not able to run and fight and defend themselves. So kind of that piece of discrimination and aging that we have to keep in mind. And then the last point is, again, this kind of caregivers, care partners is kind of the new term people are starting to use. I'm not used to using it yet, but I'm trying to test it out. It's kind of this fear of unfair and poor treatment if you place your loved one in a long-term care facility. So that sort of decreases placement. And then in general, there are disparities in Alzheimer's disease. And we know that there are disparities in the burden of illness. We know that people of color are diagnosed later in the disease, and in particularly African Americans are twice as likely to get Alzheimer's. They live longer with the disease, therefore they become more debilitated from it, so the care is much harder for those care partners to provide. Health disparities that involve differences in the ability to use the healthcare services. A lot of the work I know we used to do at the senior services was advocating for older adults. And so if you don't have someone who can help navigate, that's an issue. And then again, Blacks, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans have higher burden of illness, less access to care as compared to whites. So I know that I'm just going to say one other thing is that in healthcare, one typical thing that can happen that sometimes we don't think about is a person of color being late for a doctor's appointment. So if a person of color is late for a doctor's appointment and you're the provider or you're working in the office or whatnot, oftentimes what can happen is there's this negative bias that develops so that anybody who's a person of color that comes in late, oh yeah, well, we expect that to happen. They're always late. But really thinking about why a person is late. Is the person late because of social determinants of health issues, because they don't have transportation? They had to rely on the bus, and that's notoriously late, not on time. Or oftentimes, especially in a care partner situation or caregiver situation, they have so many multiple responsibilities that maybe they had to take a grandchild to school at the last minute. So now they're late bringing the person in. So as providers, I think that we also have to be very cautious of some of those biases that might creep up. So the way that we kind of address these, and as I go into the rest of the talk, because I'm an educator, so I'm going to educate, is that we're going to learn a little about some of the types of diversity and some of the intersectionality, all these other terms and things that we kind of talk about. But before we do that, I think that, again, you have to come from a place of understanding and empathy. So I just wanted to show you one of my favorite videos on empathy.
How to kill all mosquitoes.
Oops, hold on a second. I got to stop something here.
This simple but brilliant trick you can do tonight to eliminate all mosquitoes.
Okay, yes.
Oh, sorry. I should have it started. I was just going to bring forward a comment in the chat about re-traumatization being of particular interest, possibly in the LGBTQ population.
Yes.
In the long-term setting. So I just want to.
Yes, and I think so. And there's a lot of, in fact, one of our people here at the College of Nursing looks like she's going to get an R01 that's examining some of this space of caregiving and LGBTQ communities and settings. And I think that's a group that we often, unless, like I said, if you know someone or have made that effort to know someone, and sometimes that can be your homework assignment, is to get to know somebody who's different, somebody that you might not necessarily sit down and have a cup of coffee with. But yeah, I think we always have to keep that at the forefront. And what can be even more challenging for them is that if they're in partnered situations where there's not a power of attorney or there's no legal pieces that have been put into place, that a person who could be partnered for 20 plus years might not be able to go into the room to be with their loved one while they're dying. I mean, just things of that nature that we just have kind of this structural, really discriminatory practices that we engage in against people that aren't like us. So, but thanks for making that comment. So I'm going to go in here. Let me see if I can skip the ads. Okay. Can you all see the video?
Yes.
Yay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
There, okay, phew. I was getting ready to start talking without unmuting myself. So what do you all think about that particular video about empathy? Because I think that's one of those things that we often talk about. Terrence, I see a hand up there.
Man, that is so simple, but yet so profound, the cartoon. And, you know, in the work that I do with grief and loss, you know, that's the major component, especially when I'm dealing with African-American males. You know, our story, we get that all the time. It's like there's hardly any empathy in regards to us as we share emotions or feelings or any kind of grief or loss. And so that was very powerful. And I thank you for that.
Well, absolutely. And, you know, again, that's one of those, that's really a bias. It's like an unconscious implicit bias that you think that, okay, you know, African-American men have got to be stoic or whatever, you know, we can't talk about that kind of stuff, or even as providers, you know, well, I don't think I'm going to talk about that with them. I'll just talk about this, or making assumptions about their role, especially as care partners. Any other comments?
So Elizabeth wrote, interesting, makes me think. Lori wrote, absolutely. Michelle gave thumbs up.
All righty. And I can share that. It's in the video, or I'm going to send the slides/PDF to you so you can see that. And I think what I'll do is send slides, Sue, in case we don't get through everything, because there's a lot of cool stuff in there that you can look at and do on your own too. So, all right, let me just minimize everybody again, and we'll keep it moving. So, diversity. So when we talk about diversity, is, you know, there's obvious types of diversity that you can see. The visible diversity like skin color, age, gender, you know, even weight, obesity. There's a huge bias against people who are morbidly obese. Underrepresented groups make up less than 15% of the majority. However, those numbers are changing rapidly on a daily basis too. So some of our assumptions about diversity and equity is that, you know, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion can be difficult for a variety of reasons. You know, people will have biases and prejudices. It doesn't make us bad people. So I told you I was going to share my bias. I don't mind having it videotaped. So, because I've told people this. So my bias is middle-aged white women with Southern accents. And so it's funny because I work with somebody who fits into that category. And so it's like I had to kind of, you know, check my bias at the door, get to know the person, all those kinds of things too, and not make assumptions about how they would react, you know, like they'd be a little Southern belle or some kind of thing like that. And part of that comes from my upbringing. You know, my parents grew up in the Jim Crow era. And so they, you know, there's things that they taught you and things you couldn't do or not do. And so some of that bias is deep and underlying. So that's my admitted bias that I have. Diversity and inclusion. are not problems to be solved. Because it's not, it's not a problem. These aren't problems. These are ways in which we should be interacting anyhow. And I'll tell you, if you have a company, organization, or even a group you're in, if everybody's all the same in that group, there's not a whole lot of innovation and thinking that happens. But if you have a group that has some diverse ages, diverse backgrounds, and you're set with a challenge to overcome, you get so much more rich information and intricate problem solving that happens in diverse groups. Treating everyone the same is not equality. So we know that really we have to treat people as individuals. Diversity and inclusion is for everyone, not just those classified as minorities. Privilege does exist, and that is true. I mean, if you're sitting here in this Zoom room, listening to me talk, we all have some level of privilege as compared to other people. If you have a degree, do you have a level of privilege? And then there's also that level of privilege that comes from, based on the color of your skin or your gender. We as a society have come a long way, and we have a long way to go. So understanding the meaning of culture. So we all have a culture. Culture recognizes the importance of, our backgrounds, who we are, our race, religion, mannerisms. Right now, there's this is a holy week for Christians, and it also overlaps Ramadan, has been going on as well for the Muslim population. So there's all types of meanings to our culture. And understanding culture is tremendously important because it shapes who we are and influences how we interact with other people. So who are we? Who are we? So we're going to do just a little kind of a group exercise together here. I'm going to make my little screen a little bigger so I can see people. And, who are we? So I'll kind of start out with saying who I am. So, I'm an African-American woman who has, although I wasn't born in the South, I've got Southern roots, and I know how to speak that language. And who is anybody else that want to put in, or you can even put it in the chat. Who are you? Oh, I have to do like class. Don't make me have to call on somebody.
I'll go.
Okay.
I'm also African American, but my mother she is mixed, but unfortunately I never got the opportunity to meet her father, who was Caucasian, as he died when she was 21. I'm also married to someone that is African American. His family's from the South, but all my family is mainly up here in Ohio. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And I saw Michelle put in the chat that she's a middle-aged white Christian woman. Oh, that feels weird, Michelle. I'm sorry. How did we become middle-aged? We've known each other for so many years. I knew Michelle when she was just a baby. So, anybody else? Oh, Phyllis.
Yeah, I'll say I'm a white woman of European descent, born in the South, but I will keep my Southern accent to myself.
That's okay. I'm over it. I'm good.
Well, I should tell you, just bless your soul, but but I'm also an obese woman, so I certainly understand some of the impact of those biases as well. So.
There's one in the chat from Lori, says her microphone isn't working. A person who loves deeply, African American, and happy about it all.
Hi everyone.
Thank you.
I'm from Bhutan, one of the country in South Asia. It's between China and India. So I know most of the like I know Hindi. I speak little bit of Bengali and at the most 5 to 6 languages. So, and I was like there in Bhutan and Nepal, casteism is very much, yeah, it's too much, yeah. So that's one bias that we had to face. I had to face as myself as a minority. So that still triggers, yeah. So there used to be always a struggle, even in the school, in any public area, or even so much that when you go to their house where they were considered higher caste, we have to wash, if they give food, we have to wash plates and everything and give back to them. So
Wow.
still some, yeah, there are people who wanted to practice that here. So
Wow. So part of that caste system, as you were saying, is that?
yeah, caste system is.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't realize that still that happens even here in the United States. With some of the
in
cultures
older
too.
generation, older generation, now youth, they don't care much, but older generation still want to hold that one. Like temples built, they wanted to build, like construct, do temple, they wanted to have temple, but they don't allow the lower caste to get into it. So these are some of the. Yeah,
thank you for sharing. Thanks, everyone. And Terrence, I think you had your hand up too.
Yes, I am Kwabena Terrence Shelton. Kwabena means I was born on a Tuesday. I love to have fun and cut up. I am that guy that's going to throw something in the pot and then watch everybody buzz and spin. I am a indigenous Negro of the American continent. I am fearfully and wonderfully made, a spiritual being having a human existence. I love people and I love empowering people in their greater self.
Thank you. And then we have one, I couldn't, there was a chat that popped up. Do you want to get that? Thanks.
So Michelle wrote in, I'm a 65-year-old African-American woman who is married to a deep Southern Mississippi man who marched with Dr. King. And then John wrote in, I'm a learned male born in the United States who loves his culture deeply and very tired of race as major factor and determinant for oppression and abuse.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Appreciate that. Oops, was there one more?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, one more.
Ashley,
Okay.
Ashley, I am a African-American woman with a small portion of Sioux Indian on my father's side. I'm a caregiver at heart. And Michelle says, amen.
Amen. And I'll second that. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So who we are, man, you know, we're a lot of different people, which is just so cool about us. And it'd be great if we could get back to enjoying all of our differences too. So what are my biases? So I shared my bias with you. I'm not going to ask you to share your bias. And if you have a brain, you have a bias. So, so understanding cultural identities. We kind of actually talked a little bit about this as we've been moving forward. So I would encourage you to take a moment, not right now, because I'm looking at the time, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going way fast. And I'm just on slide 17 of 67. So I'm going to move through and we won't do this particular exercise, but you can do that one yourself. And we talked about biases. So what I am going to do next, this is an interesting exercise, and it's called First Thoughts. So I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to tell me or type in the chat, what is your first thought when you see the picture? Okay, is everybody ready? Got your typing fingers ready? And Sue, you're the orator here, so here we go. First picture.
Phyllis writes wishful. You want me to share them as I see them?
Yeah, you can share them as you see them.
Cognitive
Oh, you see it, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Shopping.
no, go ahead.
So many options. American Girl, babies. Kid audition. I'm not sure. Where's me? Confused. Where am I?
And so first thought when you see that, you know, it looks different. And I don't know that we won't have time to do this particular video, but there's this whole doll test, if anybody's ever seen this before. And I have it in the link, and you can watch the doll test link, because probably not so much now, but certainly when I was growing up, there weren't a whole lot of options for dolls that looked like me. And even with the doll test, and that wasn't done, they did it like a remake of the doll test, that the kids had certain preconceived ideas about, you know, which doll was the bad doll, which one's the good doll. So the black doll was the bad doll and the good doll was the white doll. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that particular doll test too.
I think an interesting variation on that would be having a boy looking at the dolls too.
Yes. Yeah. So how about this video or picture? Oh, then somebody commented about the Bobo doll experiment is very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, there were a few more. I didn't get to all of them. I don't know.
Okay. So what do you see? What do you think when you see this one? Privilege.
Yeah, privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Luxury. Dog is attentive. Snooty. Not interested.
Mm-hmm.
Entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure what to make of this
Yeah,
one.
this one. Yeah. I was kind of that way when I first saw it. I'm like, what? You know, so you have someone who's a person of color, and then there's a white woman serving her instead. Tables have turned.
Yeah,
I saw
yeah.
that.
Looks like an ad.
Yeah. And now I have one more.
Never heard of this. Oh, sorry.
And there's one more.
Karen says, wow.
Yeah. For those of us that go get the manis and the petties.
Role reversal, excluded, relaxing, ticklish, challenging stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tables are definitely turned.
Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of, you know, what I think of too when I see this, because I am one of those people that are, you know, that go to the, you know, nail salon, etc. That, you know, you do have these biases because you see people, usually you see it the opposite, you know, it's the people of East Asian descent that are doing our nails, and then we're sitting there getting pedicures and all that stuff. So, you know, it's just those kind of subtle things.
Marcus
go ahead.
wrote in abusive too.
Abusive. So I have another thing for you. We're going to talk about some of the terms. Oh, experience. Oh, experience this at a salon in Fairlawn. Okay. Oh, I remember. Miss Fairlawn. Used to live in Fairlawn. So priming. Have you ever heard of something called priming before? So basically, kind of the sense of priming is that you are giving kind of a preconceived idea about a person. Or so, for example, you might see this with the nurses taking care of patient in 4OB, and saying that, oh yeah, that person is really demanding or whatever. So you're already setting up the scenario for the interaction that you're going to have with that person. It's being influenced by what other people have said. So when it comes to, what does the evidence say with regards to implicit bias? Almost all studies found evidence for implicit bias among physicians and nurses, so health providers. There is a correlational evidence that indicates that biases are likely to influence diagnoses, treatment decisions. For example, especially for women who come into the healthcare setting or emergency room with symptoms of an MI or symptoms of cardiovascular problems can often get dismissed. Perfect example, one of my friends is in the hospital right now that having abdominal pain and had to have some exploratory surgery, and doctor asking, well, is all this related to stress or your nerves, or, making those assumptions about women being, quote, mentally fragile or that kind of thing. The following characteristics are at issue: race, ethnicity, social economic status, age, mental illness, weight, having AIDS, HIV, brain injured patients. All of these individuals, people who have substance abuse, there's lots of biases that happen. So we're going to do some unpacking of some of these biases. Bias has to be taught. If you hear your parents downgrading women or people of different backgrounds, why you are going to do that too. So it's about us unlearning in many cases what we've learned. So I have a video here for you. Hope it plays. Okay. Can you see a video?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I love that this is a beer commercial, but yeah, so what would you do? I know the first time I saw it, I'm thinking, oh, no, I would just turn around and not go back in there. And that's probably one of my biases too, as biker dudes. So what are some of your thoughts about that?
Ashley just typed in she loved it. That was pretty cool. I used to do that to my students when they came in late. Terrence, good stuff. I would have definitely turned around just because of the crowdedness only. Truthfully leave. Go sit down. I probably would have said something out loud like, oh, okay, we're deep in here, huh?
Yeah. Of course, this was I did this pre-pandemic too. So yeah, you're right about that. About all the people packed in there too. That's the other thing. We're not used to sitting on top of each other anymore. But yeah, and I had a really cool thing happen when I did this presentation with the faculty here. And I had someone who said that she saw a young man and woman, they were pushing a stroller, and the man was just, you know, tatted up from head to toe and the rings and all this kind of stuff. And she kind of stopped herself, you know, because before she'd be like, oh my gosh, look at this, you know, tatted up person or whatever, or started making judgments. But she said after going through kind of this implicit unconscious bias training and having some awareness brought to herself, that she didn't feel as threatened or anxious being around someone who looked like that. So I just thought that was pretty cool to happen. Yep. Yeah, I'd have been afraid too. And I'm just telling the truth. I would have been, I wouldn't do it. I'm not that brave.
As a woman,
So-
I'd be more aware of it if by myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you, you know, too, for your participating and getting into the chat and everything. I appreciate that. So biases, you have implicit. So those are attitudes and stereotypes that we have unconsciously. They can be favorable or unfavorable. You know, you can have what's called an affinity bias, where there might be someone who reminds you of what you were like when you were younger or something of that nature, and you give them more breaks than other people. Also, it can lead to inequity. And the good part is a lot of these biases can be unlearned. Now, explicit biases, that's more attitudes and beliefs that we share that are more conscious, things that we say. This bias tends to be expressed with perceived threat. And, you know, having this kind of unconscious ability that we have to sort and deem things as safe or unsafe, you know, we needed to have that. And we still do to many degrees. You know, if you're out somewhere that you've never been before and it's dark, you know, you're going to be assessing the situation, and it's a protective mechanism. But also it can be one of those situations where we have kind of these deep-seated biases that, you know, that are often concealed. So please know, implicit bias is not racism. You know, it doesn't mean that, you know, I have that little thing about the Southern white women, means that I'm a racist against white people because of that. So defining some of the biases and the isms, you could probably even add a few more of those. You know, we have racism, sexism, ageism, classism, ableism, you know, being against disabled, heterosexualism. There's all types of biases that we can have. Oops, there we go. So again, you know, this kind of talks more about the implicit bias that, you know, and that's why it's so important for us to have diverse representation in our groups and in hiring practices in particular, because our tendency is going to be to go towards someone or people who are most like us, because it's just kind of the way we function, and it's just comfortable. So we're going to do another little test here, and it's called the power of implicit associations. So you're going to see a series of color words on the screen. You can say the word aloud as quickly as possible so we can move to the next word. So there might be, I can have a few people that might be brave to go audio for this. If you could do that, that'd be great. So
Skip the chat on this one. That's kind of slow.
skip the chat.
Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're saying? Because it's a lag on.
Yeah. Just skip the chat. Thank you. And just say it out loud for people, or you can say it out loud to yourself with your microphone off. But if I can get at least 1 or 2 people that say it out loud, it kind of makes it interesting when you do that. So here we go. So I'm going to move these words through and you say the word as quickly as possible. Ready, set, go.
Red.
Red.
Whoops, where'd the other ones go? Oh, wait a minute. It's not working. What the heck? Hold on a second.
Blue,
No.
blue, green,
Green.
green,
Yellow.
yellow,
Yellow.
yellow,
Blue.
Green.
green,
Red.
yellow,
Red.
red,
Yellow.
yellow,
No.
Blue.
blue,
Red.
red,
Green.
Green.
Yellow.
green,
Blue.
yellow,
Blue.
blue.
Okay. So the next thing we're going to do
Red.
is round 2. So this is going to be a little different. Okay. So you're going to see a series of words on the screen. So say the color the word is printed in as quickly as possible. So for example, this says red, but the color is blue. Okay. So are you ready? So if it says red, but the color is blue, it's not red, it's blue. Okay, here we go.
Blue.
No.
Green,
Green.
Green.
Blue.
red,
Blue.
Blue.
Red.
red,
Red.
green,
Blue.
Green.
Green.
Yellow.
Green.
blue,
Red.
red,
Orange.
yellow,
Green. Red.
blue,
Red.
Green.
green,
Green.
blue,
Uh-huh. Yeah, so here you go. That's just how biases happen. It's fast. It's fast, right? I don't think anybody got any right. Okay, so what happened? So the implicit association test. So I encourage anyone to take this test. I don't know, did I send the link to you all? If not, I'll include the link to this so you can take it on your own. It's quite interesting. And it's a huge study. It's like ongoing through Harvard. It's a test of mental association. It's a project of Implicit that offers opportunities for education about how our minds represent social groups in society, attitudes, stereotypes, age, gender, sexuality, religion, etc. And I actually took this to see if I had an age bias because I wondered if I did or not. I'm in aging work, but fortunately, I didn't have one. But there's age, there's gender, there's all types of characteristics that you can take this test about. And what it'll be is just what you saw. There'll be a bunch of statements or pictures, and you just answer it really quickly. And then it gives you your own little assessment of what your biases might be in a particular area. And it's free. That's the other thing. And so me and you. I'm going to show you another video that's really interesting about faces and how we can have biases in relation to faces. So I'm going to, fingers crossed, hope it works. This one's working, I think. There we go.
Psychologist Alexander Todorov has discovered the mathematics underlying our first impressions. Using data he's collected from thousands of people at Princeton University, Dr. Todorov has built a computer program that can pinpoint the very parts of the face that trigger our gut instincts. That is, whether someone looks aggressive, introverted, attractive, and so on. See for yourself. As quickly as you can, answer this question. Which of these two people is more trustworthy, A or B? And what about from this pair? And this one? This probably wasn't hard, and in fact, you could have done it even faster. Here's Dr. Todorov.
You don't need more than 160 to 100 milliseconds to get pretty much the same first impression you will get from unlimited time.
This was Dr. Todorov's first finding, that first impressions are fast. The second finding is perhaps even more surprising. Almost everyone sees the same thing. Consider the faces you just saw. If you're like the majority of people in Dr. Todorov's studies, these are the ones you chose as being more trustworthy. And what about competence? Just look at this face created by Dr. Todorov's software. The changes to this face are small. The tilt of the mouth, the size of the brow, the distance between the eyes. And yet, taken together, these features trigger a judgment. If we're honest, we'll admit that this face seems to be gaining and losing IQ points right in front of our very eyes. We're all familiar with sayings like, don't judge a book by its cover. But we do. And Dr. Todorov's studies show this too.
We did some studies presenting participants' faces of politicians, and it turns out that using judgments of naive participants, we can predict about 70% of the electoral outcomes. In a nutshell, politicians who happen to look more competent than their rivals are more likely to win in the elections.
These findings, which included almost every major congressional candidate for the 2004 to 2008 elections, are incredible. Campaign promises, advertisements, and experience aside, what really matters is how you look. And faces don't just sway who we elect to lead our governments. They also affect who we hire, who we give opportunities to, who we promote. Now, if everyone sees the same thing when they look at a face, it raises the question, are these impressions accurate? Do people look more competent because they actually are more competent? Do they look more trustworthy because they are more trustworthy? The short answer is no.
Often the natural assumption is there must be some kernel of truth in these impressions. But if you look closely at the data, there's very, very little evidence that these judgments are accurate. In many situations, you can ignore completely the face and your judgment will be much better.
If faces are so misleading, the question then, of course, is why? Why do our brains do this? Here's a popular theory for the case of trustworthiness. We look more trustworthy the more we look like babies. Large eyes, small chins, round faces, these are the features we love about infants, the most trustworthy creatures there are. So when adults possess these features, we view them as more trustworthy, kind, and honest. Research tells us we're more likely to agree with baby-faced adults, to accept their offers in negotiations. We're even less likely to convict baby-faced defendants for premeditated crimes, and more likely to give them more lenient sentences when we do. And what does this mean for the workplace? Are baby-faced employees more likely to get the benefit of the doubt in a workplace dispute? Does the width of your jaw influence your hireability? Clearly, our first impressions can get us into trouble. So let's talk about how to get around them and make better decisions. It's hard, first impressions are but if we can admit that these judgments happen, we can find simple ways to outsmart our minds. How many times have you said or heard something like this?
I felt like I could trust her as soon as I met her.
Or,
I can really see him in this role.
When you catch these moments, ask a simple question. Based on what? Want something stronger? Here's one senior leader in education's strategy. As soon as I meet someone, I acknowledge my first impression in the first 5 seconds and spend the rest of the interview trying to prove myself wrong. Be your own devil's advocate by challenging your first impressions. Finally, when applicable, try putting off the face-to-face early on in the hiring process. Focus on hard evidence of skill, talent, and experience that's in a resume or other objective forms of data as a first step. We can all be blinded by first impressions, but with regular practice, we can learn to look past the surface.
Okay, oops, there, okay, I'm back. Okay.
So Terrence just wrote in the chat, the more we look like babies, wow. And then Phyllis wrote, it'd be interesting to see how the mask wearing during COVID impacted judgment.
Yes. Like maybe we might have been better because we didn't see the whole face. Good point. So just a few discussion questions about that. I'm always, every time I look at that, I'm always fascinated because it's like I can feel myself liking the baby faces better. What are the risks of forming appearance-based first impressions quickly in your workplace or setting that you're in? So what are some of the, for forming those impressions quickly? Let me get my screen up a little bit bigger so I can see any hands. So what are the risks of forming those impressions quickly?
Charlene, oh, sorry, that was to me, never mind. Thanks, Charlene.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think the biggest risk is that you can be critically deadly wrong, and it can cost your life. You know, that's
Yeah, it could be, especially if you're giving, you know, you're giving power and having confidence in someone who really doesn't know what they're doing just by how they look. So how do you know when an appearance-based first impression might be influencing your decision?
I guess I'm the only one gonna talk today. I think for me,
And me and you, we got this, Terrence.
right. I think for me, it's when I began to steer my conversations around those appearances, right? I think the conversation is kind of, you know, it's a geared around those, because that genders like a pleasant conversation. And, you know, and the danger in that is that it avoids the tough questions that might be needed to ask, instead of that relationship-based questioning, or due to those first appearance-based impressions.
Yeah.
Kelly wrote into the chat, when you're ignoring all red flags, other people are expressing concerns.
Yeah, it sort of lets your guard down, so to speak. And it was so interesting. I had an opportunity to be on a search committee for a aging researcher. And so the most interesting thing happened as I was sitting there, and we had one candidate who really didn't have experience, and it was for, you know, a high, you know, director level position. And he was very, you know, very nice looking gentleman, and very personable. And he reminded me of somebody I used to work with and all this stuff. And for a moment, I kind of got caught up in the whole, yeah, he's really great. But then I just started observing my colleagues, and especially the men. And they were just, and they even said, oh, you know, you remind me of when I first started out. And yeah, I don't have a lot of experience, but we can show you this and da-da-da-da-da. And I'm thinking, this is not going to be the right candidate for this particular job. You know, fortunately, we ended up not hiring the person because really they just didn't have the experience. But I just witnessed it firsthand how somehow, you know, that whole, you know, and he had kind of, now that I think of it, he kind of like a baby face look too. How that can just get carried away with that impression. And so and that's another good reason why it's good to have multiple people and different people in an interview with different backgrounds and not just the same person. So
Kelly also wrote in no logic based, your based, I guess that your decision is based on. Michelle says you haven't asked any questions that need to be asked and you feel you know the answers already. And then Marcus wrote, there can be mistrust and guilt. I can't see. Ooh. Guilt late. I don't know. I feel like, I mean, the jury part of it, that's really strikes me. You know this, but it's like, it's scary to hear it. And we do it, we recognize it with politicians. Like we know it. It's like they look like a politician. They look like it, right? Like we have an expectation of what a politician should look like. And like it's almost like they have to look like this before they, it's terrible.
I know. It's like, yeah. And so luckily on the next slide, we've got ways that we can take action. And some of the things that you've even mentioned already too as a group. Oh, I just saw in the chat somebody like Ted Bundy. I know, right? Yeah, that's where like it'll cost your life because he was a good looking man and you wouldn't think. So, you know, you catch yourself and ask yourself, you know, what am I basing that judgment on? You know, being your own devil's advocate, focus on objective forms of data, you know, like focusing on their resume and their experiences and their references and different things that are going to be more objective. So with the impact of bias, I'm going to, because I know we're getting on time too, you can watch this video on your own too about the wrong room, and those were questions. But I did want to put this one slide up too, because this is something that often happens and people don't realize that it's not necessarily a compliment. So, you know, an African-American employee being complimented on being articulate and bright, you know, why does it surprise you that the person is articulate and bright? And so the hidden message can be, you know, most African-Americans are inarticulate and lack intelligence. So instead, you know, what you may perceive to be a compliment may be an insult. So it's important to kind of recognize the bias, because in a way that you can test yourself on that is that, you know, would you have, you know, if the person was a non, you know, African-American, a white woman or a white male, would you say the same thing? Or maybe you would, I don't know. But I just wanted to throw that one out there because it can be perceived by the minoritized individual as, well, why wouldn't you think I'd be articulate? So, and then, you know, this just talks about implicit bias can affect employment decisions. You know, it's interesting research that's been done on even applicants' names and how, you know, if they have kind of an ethnic sounding name that they can get taken out of the group. So this is just more about the ethnic sounding names. And, you know, so let's talk about, you know, how you can break, you know, some of those biases. Number one, you know, breaking bias. There's this exercise you can do, it's called the privilege walk, where you get in a circle and there's like a list of different things that you say. And for each person who has that particular characteristic, they walk closer into the circle or out of the circle. Don't make assumptions. Of course, you know, with the assumption, there's that word in the middle or at the beginning of assumption that it makes a you know what out of you and me, as people say. You know, just how people are perceived. I know that when I used to do home visits, I would have people think that I was the nurse aide coming to see them and not the nurse coming to see them. So, excuse me. So these are just some of the different types of bias that you can have. There's a perception bias. So, if you see this Muslim woman with her hijab on and her face covered, you might have a perception that she's oppressed or, really doesn't want to be all covered like that, but she has to be covered. And, that's kind of a judgment that you make about certain people or members of groups. There's something called a halo effect, the tendency to think everything good about the person because you just like that person. So again, that can lead to behaviors of being more lenient, promotions given to people because you like them, you just like that person. And then the affinity bias is kind of similar to the halo effect, but the affinity really is that person's like a mirror image of you. So that you have kind of this bias towards them because, man, I remember when I started out as a nurse, that student reminds me so much of me. And then there's confirmation biases, a tendency to seek information that confirms pre-existing beliefs, like the example that I gave about, Black people being late to their appointments and, aha, that's right. This person's Black and they were late. So that confirms my bias that they're always late. Microaggressions. So those are kind of like subtle, semi-conscious messages that happen that we send out. A really simple example of a microaggression can be if you walk into a college of medicine and you see all of the pictures of the previous deans or whatnot, and all you see are men, there's no women up there. What do students feel, see, or think when they don't see people who look like them, or even pictures of people like them doing healthcare activities? Those are kind of like subtle things that can happen. Assuming that, I know a lot of examples I do are students, you can tell I'm like way into academia now, is assuming that, excuse me, if an African-American male student is tall, he's on the basketball team here at OSU. So just those little things that can happen. And then micro affirmations. So instead of aggressions, we can have affirmations of good things that we can say. So, connecting with people as individuals. So respond to what's really being said by paraphrasing and empathizing what they say. Appreciate and praise the strengths of individuals. Affirming others in a culturally appropriate way. And that increases our chances of blocking some of the biases that we have. These are some additional micro affirmations that we can give, like greeting employees, colleagues, and customers with sincerity. So people, greeting people with sincerity. I think we've lost the art of just saying hi to people, even if you don't know who they are. Just say hi anyhow. What's it going to hurt? Connect person to person, bring a personal element to your interactions and acknowledge each employee and person behind the role or position that they occupy. So, people can be unconsciously biased towards people who are doing the cleaning and that kind of thing. Making an effort to say hi to whoever's emptying the trash or cleaning the toilets. Be present to the other person and really focus your attention on them and listen to what they're saying. So other strategies we can do, keeping the door to your inner circle open. So meeting new people that you wouldn't normally engage with. Soliciting diverse points of view. So if you're in a room and everybody says yes to something and agrees, then try to seek some other opinions, being that devil's advocate. So mindsets for managing blind spots. So recognize that we have blind spots. Explore potential impact of your behaviors, action, and learn. So this is a nice table that you can take a look at that gives examples of how we can, act with intention, challenging assumptions, being mindful. One of the best books that I read during the pandemic, read a lot of them at that time, was this book called Mindful of Race. And it was just a really good introspective way of examining racism and discrimination from a mindfulness perspective. And it can be for anybody, and you don't have to be a minoritized person to read the book, but it was fantastic. So breaking habits of biases, having intention. You're not going to be perfect all the time. We're always going to have biases, but it's a matter of really working towards breaking them. So instead of, like the microaggressions, have micro affirmations, saying good things in order to dispel some of the microaggressive beliefs. So these are additional strategies for neutralizing some of our biases that we have. Perspective taking, for example, take the perspective of a member of the group against which you have the unconscious bias. So, me having a different perspective with my Southern white women who are middle-aged. So what do you plan to do to minimize biases? And you don't have to answer this, but it's just a thought that you can have to yourself. I encourage each of you to do that, to, what can you do to minimize biases? So I have another video, but I would just say, take a look at this on your own. It's a really powerful video because I want to at least leave 5 minutes for some questions that you might have that you'd like to ask or comments to make.
Kathy, I have to join a meeting with Kathy Blake here in 5 minutes, so I'm going to have Michelle kind of do the chat now.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank
no
you
worries.
so much.
You're welcome. See you
right.
later.
Sorry.
Yes, I will give you the slides. I'll send those off to Michelle, and then she can send them. I will also send you my flyer for my study that I'm recruiting for throughout the United States. I'm looking for caregivers, African-American caregivers with hypertension or cardiovascular risk factors. Anything else, comments or questions?
I made a comment, the baby-faced people both trust and be deceitful. I didn't mean to say they can be deceitful. That's an oxymoron. And I was trying to say,
oh, that's okay.
Baby-faced people can garner all trust, which they can use as a means of being deceitful. But at the same time, that's a bias, because a lot of times people may say, oh, you just, got the little cuteness of face, but you're not really as sweet as you look or something. Yep. Our speaker has a baby face. Yep. And
I might not be that sweet. Yeah, I might not be that sweet.
I grew up looking younger than I am. Now I look closer to my age, but it was kind of funny because a lot of times you get over because you look younger, and people will say things like, well, what do you know about it? And they don't say, well, what do you know about it? there's a difference in the way you say, what do you know about it? That's just something
Yeah.
to throw out there.
Yeah, no, that's true. We can have biases in relation to our age, younger people too. There's younger people bias. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't lived. Yeah. So,
And I think you can see in the chat, Kathy, Terrence said, recognizing we have biases is one thing, taking actions is the whole other thing, individually, collectively, and systematically.
touche. Yeah. And that's where the the most change will happen if it's a systematic approach. I mean, we can make changes ourselves. I'm going to send you all a good article too that I found that had I couldn't get that doggone table to copy and put on the slide, but it had a really good model of how we could implement system change as it relates to implicit biases and such too. So I'll send that along with the other stuff. So I'm sending you a lot of stuff. And then I'm just going to put my email in the chat. In the event that you have other questions that pop up down the road. And I will say that I really enjoyed my time with you all this afternoon. And, you know, considering it's a Zoom environment, you guys were pretty interactive and chatted up in the chat and chatted in audibly so we could hear it. So I do appreciate you doing that. And I do appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you.